I'm Jason Palmentel, and I'm joined by the wonderful Erin McLaughlin as my co-moderator. For all of you who've been following along with Microsoft's goings on lately, one of the designers of the typefaces, yes, I'm bringing that up. But they're all really wonderful typefaces, so it's nice to have that here, and actually have all of these new typefaces to look at. So thank you for your work in that.
You're welcome. Anyway.
I wasn't supposed to be ad-libbing about that, was I? Okay, well, I'll go back to our loosely made and mostly ignored script.
Yes.
We have with us today Elika Etemad and Ethan Wang, who are going to be talking about some really I'm super excited stuff about what's coming in CSS for text alignment. And they will be introducing themselves in their recording, so I won't repeat all of that. But I do want to let people know that we hope you will be bringing lots of questions, and it won't just be me pestering them with ones after the fact. But there is a Q&A tab, so hopefully you've seen that, not just the regular chat, but the icon next to it for posting questions. And that will make it a lot easier for Erin and I to kind of bring those up at the end and kind of read them out for everybody and get the discussion rolling after the presentation is done. And so with that, I will turn it over to Elika and Ethan.
Hi, my name is Elika Etemad. I'm also known as Fantasai. I'm an invited expert in the CSS working group at W3C.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ethan Wang. I'm a UX designer at Microsoft. I'm honored and excited to be here today to present with the fantasai as an advocate of the awesome CSS features that she's been working on, and to talk about how these features are going to impact the web design and development community.
We'll be presenting about precise text alignment in CSS, why we don't have it, and how we're hoping to work with the fonts community to get it working in the unpredictable and automatic world of the web. First, I want to wind back the clock to explain how we got here. Back when the web was young, there were basically only 3 font metrics used to lay out text: the ascent, the descent, and the alphabetic baseline, which was the 0 point in between. The typesetting model was very simple. Put a bunch of stuff on a line, aligned on a baseline, of course, draw a box around it, and then keep adding boxes like that until you run out of content. Ta-da, we're done. You might notice a few things about this model. First off, there's no overlap or clipping of the content, even though we mix different font sizes and even threw in an image. But this model makes sure that you can still read the content no matter what. Secondly, you might notice there's no control over spacing. Whatever the default spacing is in the font, that's what you get. Back in the days before CSS, there were basically 2 options for introducing space into your design. You could add a blank line whose height you can control by changing the font size, or you can insert a transparent image. These were called spacer GIFs, and this technique has thankfully been lost to the mists of time. Anyway, some smart people decided that this was no way to do page layout and invented CSS. It came with the revolutionary ability to specify margins around things and also line spacing. The line height property can accept a fixed length or a multiplier of the font size, and this is what introduced leading to the web. So now leading, you actually have to put it somewhere. You could put it below each line, or you can put it above every line. But the problem is that when you draw a box around your paragraph, it looks really uneven if you do that. And if we only put leading between lines within a paragraph and not between paragraphs, then the space between the paragraphs won't be matching the space within the paragraphs. So the inventors of CSS decided to put the leading on both sides of the line, half above and half below. Now let's talk about how this actually works. Let's say we have a line height of 1.5. Since the font size is nominally 1em, this means a line height of 1.5em. You would think this means that half leading of 1/4 em above and 1/4 em below, but the fact is the distance from the top of the ascent to the bottom of the descent isn't always 1em. So in CSS, half leading is actually calculated by subtracting the ascent and descent both from the line height and applying half that amount above and half below the text. Now that we understand the model of text on the web, let's talk about the problems. Problem number 1, inconsistent spacing. You probably already noticed this from the earlier example with mixed font sizes, but the problem is actually even more insidious. You see, even if we specify the exact same font size, the ascents and descents of different fonts are different, in some cases wildly different. Even if they all add up to 1M, which they generally don't outside of East Asian writing, different typefaces have different ratios between the ascent and descent as a function of their design. So when you line them up along the baseline, their top and bottom edges don't line up. When we add a half leading, it equalizes the heights, but not their positions, and it can actually exacerbate the situation, particularly when there's font size changes. So finally, we draw our line box around the text, and as you can see, the height of this line is definitely more than 1.5M. Even without changing the size of any content on the line, just changing the font family can create noticeable jitter in paragraph line spacing.
Now let's take a look at how the way our text boxes are constructed are going to affect alignment. So here is an example of a news article design. Very common these days on like all kinds of news websites. What typically happens behind the scene is when the designer or the developer is aligning the title with the image, they would align the text box with the image. However, the problem is the bounding box is like only a construct that we can see. It's actually it's invisible to our end users. So if I get rid of the highlight here, you can see the top of the image is actually not aligned with the top edge of the text, which is the cap height. And then we just learned that CSS1 introduced half leadings. So what about removing them? Does that solve the problem? As you can see here, if half leadings were not there, there's still a gap here. So why is that? Well, we learned that when you increase the line height, adds like 2 half leadings, but there's still built-in space in the default line box to accommodate certain characters and accent signs. So what do we do? Well, from implementation perspective, we can offset the extra space there using a negative margin. But it's not always the most reliable way because when the font changes, your alignment can get easily thrown off. And then font change is something that can happen quite often. Let's say when the browser falls back to the default font, or maybe you like to just experiment with a different font on your website. And then because of the built-in spacing text boxes, it can also cause centering issues as well. So in this example, it is my intention to vertically center the name within the card. While the text box is centered, you can see 70 pixels on top and 70 pixels below. The actual text is not. And then because each font is designed differently, they might have different ascent and descent metrics. So in other words, the baseline position within the text box might shift around as well. So to give you an idea, when the font goes from like Seoul to San Francisco, the text box position remains the same, but the text within it shifted. And then here's another like more obvious example. Because of the extra space reserved in default line box, as well as the half leadings, a bigger problem is uncontrollable spacing. So let's say I have a card and I would like to keep the spacings all the way around equal by setting them all to 40 pixels. But once again, when the bounding boxes are not visible anymore, the visual spacings are not 40 pixels anymore. In fact, they're not only bigger than 40 pixels, but also like inconsistent with each other. This problem is actually very common everywhere you look on the web, and because some of our most popular UI design tools adopted the same model to render text boxes, we experience this problem in our design tools as well. And as like UI designers, we love to make things pixel perfect. We can always like manually position things in our designs, but as I briefly mentioned, it's not always easy to achieve this in code. And then personally, I was very troubled by the extra space problem for a really long time, and I couldn't find a good approach that doesn't break design dev handoff. So when searching for a solution, I found what Fantasai was working on, got in touch, and really became an advocate for the new features that you're about to see. So now I would like to hand it back to her to learn more about how she's designing for solutions.
We've talked about the origins of the web's typesetting model and some of the problems with it. Now let's talk about designing a solution. First, we have to acknowledge the system constraints we're operating under. When designing for print, designers have the opportunity to check and adjust their output before showing it to the reader. If something's off, you can tweak it until it looks right. But on the web, the final layout is created on the fly on the user's computer using that computer's environment and resources. We can't know the exact size and shape of the output medium. It could be anything from a compact phone to an ultra-wide monitor. We also don't know what fonts will be used to render the text. We can specify some preferences, but even with downloadable fonts, due to network errors, user preferences, or other factors, there's no real guarantee that you'll get the font you asked for. And in many real-world cases, we don't even know the actual content, since it might be user-generated or database-generated or even passed through a translator. That text could be significantly longer or shorter than expected. It's just not possible for web designers to tweak the page for every user's unique view, so they have to be able to give instructions to the browser to perform the design logic on the client side. Let's say I designed this text in a box. I set the font to this particular typeface, and I set the box to this particular size. It looks perfect. If we substitute the font out for a different one, though, it no longer fits that same box. This is what happens in desktop publishing applications like InDesign. The reason is I didn't actually want the box to be that size particularly. I wanted it to fit the text. In CSS, we try to give the designer the ability to express that. So when we swap out the font, it still fits exactly. In CSS, we need to design solutions that are flexible, that are able to adapt to various environments as if the page was originally designed there, that are robust to be able to handle unexpected font content or media change sizes without making the page unreadable, and especially that do their best not to obscure the content unless the designer specifically asked for that. For text layout, that means we can't just give the designer absolute control over the positioning of text and say we're done. Because as the text or the font or the environment changes, that could result in incorrectly positioned or even overlapping text. So what do? Well, we're looking at using font metrics. As we discussed earlier, each font has metrics describing its overall glyph design. There are more metrics in OpenType than the ascent, descent, and the alphabetic baseline, and we can use some of these to solve our problems in CSS text layout. We're going to talk about some of the upcoming features in CSS that are using font metrics to give more power to designers without the brittle absolutism that breaks down in an unpredictable web environment. First, let's talk about letting trim. Remember that half letting we talked about earlier and the extra space in the font reserved for diacritics and other ascenders and descenders? This space is what gets in the way of visual alignment of the text. So we're introducing controls to trim that space away for the purpose of text layout. In the current version of the proposal, the text edge property indicates which metric to trim to, and the letting trim property indicates whether to trim that space at the start or end of a particular element. This lets us handle the text using these edges as its bounding box when sizing and aligning the element. Notably, it doesn't affect the spacing between lines within the element. So if the text wraps, it's still spaced out okay and won't overlap itself.
Letting trim is the proposal that I'm really excited about. As you can see, your browsers will be able to trim off all the extra space in your text boxes for you and give you really clean and accurate spacings. And I think this really opens the door for a lot of things. For example, starting from design, we can start measuring optical spacing without worrying about it not being able to translate the code. And then if you're a UX designer like me, you're probably like familiar with the design systems. A lot of design systems come with a spacing system. It's essentially like a set of spacing values that designers can choose from in their designs to keep spacings consistent. Today, applying a spacing system wouldn't be visually accurate because of all the extra spacing our text boxes. But leading trim will finally allow us to have an accurate spacing system that's achievable in both our designs and in code. Similarly, you'll be able to like easily align the cap height with the top of a UI element with the leading trim, and you don't have to worry about font changes throwing off your alignment. And with the leading trim, centering the bounded box is centering the ink, no matter what font you're using. Leading trim really is one of the main examples where CSS utilizes font metrics. Another use case that I'm also looking forward to is initial letter that will be used to implement drop caps. So drop caps are also like very common on a lot of, I guess, like consumption experiences. They're really elegant, but at this point, you probably guessed that it's very hard to implement. So technically for a drop initial, right, you're supposed to align the cap height of the first letter to the cap height of the first line, and then baseline to whichever baseline you would like to choose. However, font size doesn't necessarily translate to the size of the ink. So if we were to implement it today without like a new CSS feature, we would have to manually figure out the font size and write like 20 plus lines of CSS plus HTML to make it both accessible and pixel perfect. But it still doesn't cover like the font change problem that we talked about earlier. So this new CSS feature that fantasai and the working group are introducing is called initial letter, and then you'll be able to like easily implement a drop initial, for example, like a drop initial, sunken initial, or like raised initial with just 2 lines of CSS. So this feature also works by browsers accessing font metrics. So instead of like us manually figure out what font size it should be for the reference points to align perfectly, browsers will do all the math for us and then align them perfectly. So this feature is currently available in Safari. I've tried it, it's pretty cool. So check it out. A lot of the CSS features are leveraging like baseline as a key metric to do the magic. And as designers, we always know to align our text on the baseline. But to be super accurate, it is for Latin scripts, the text should be aligned on the alphabetic baseline, which indicates there's probably like more than one baseline. So there's the middle baseline that goes halfway between the alphabetic and the X height baselines. There's the central baseline, which typically crosses the center of the M box. And then there's the ideographic baseline for CJK languages. For some like index scripts, there's the hand baseline. And then lastly, there's the mathematical baseline as well. With all of these additional baseline options, we'll have more flexibility when it comes to like aligning our text. To give you an example, let's say you have a website that's in Chinese. Occasionally, you would like to like emphasize certain words by making them bigger. So in this case, instead of like relying on the alphabetic baseline, you can set a dominant baseline for the entire document to be ideographic. And then by default, browsers will use the ideographic baseline to align content so it will look better. So similarly, let's say if you have a document that's in Hindi and then you choose different fonts for different content, different words. At this time, you can set the dominant baseline to hang instead of alphabetic to align the text to have this like nice alignment. And then let's say there are like a few places where English would appear. As you can see, like for English, aligned to the hang baseline doesn't look optimal. The good thing is these additional baseline options are also like added to the existing vertical align property, where it allows you to have like granular control over specific places like this to align them properly. Back to you, fantasai.
We talked about the existing CSS line layout model earlier. Another idea we're exploring is a new line layout model. In addition to comfortable spacing of the text, one of the purposes of leading in a paragraph is to allow space for anomalies like font changes or superscripts. But as we saw earlier, applying half leading to each item on a line leads to some very undesirable results. So rather than treating line spacing as a property on each glyph, what we really want is to apply it to each line, attaching it to the primary font of the paragraph and only expanding the line to fit nested content if that content doesn't fit within the bounds of this half leading. This way, we can reduce or eliminate the jitter that comes from font changes within a paragraph while allowing genuinely larger content to still expand the line height. Speaking of superscripts, another new feature that is already spec'd and is implemented in Firefox is the font variant position property. This property allows authors to opt into the superscript, subscript, and ordinal glyph variants in fonts that support them. These glyphs differ from simply reducing the size of regular glyphs and shifting its position. They're weighted to match the texture of the regular glyphs at that size. You can also get these glyphs by passing in the raw OpenType feature code to the font using the font feature settings property. But many fonts don't have variant glyphs for superscripts and subscripts, and even those that do don't have them for all characters. In these cases, the font will fall back to regular glyphs. For most font features, that wouldn't be a problem, but because superscripts and subscripts mean something different, this kind of fallback corrupts the meaning of the text. So in addition to providing more ergonomic syntax for these font features, font variant position also falls back to browser synthesized superscript and subscript glyphs when the font doesn't provide its own. The problem is the synthesized glyphs don't quite match the real ones. Our solution here is to trigger fallback rendering of all characters in the same text run whenever any of them is missing. This looks a lot better. But while this fixes the mismatch within a text run, we'll still have a mismatch across text runs. It's not confusing that way, but it doesn't really look as nice as it should. To look nice, we need to match the size and shift of the font design, which fortunately OpenType already has metrics for. And now we come to the problems with using font metrics for text layout. First of all, because of the divergent history of OpenType, it's inherited duplicates of certain metrics, and different platforms use different ones. Another problem, and this is why Firefox does not use OpenType metrics for its superscript synthesis, is that a lot of fonts have bad metrics. Certain font foundries, who shall remain nameless, just put the same numbers into the metrics tables of all their fonts, regardless of their actual glyph designs. And lastly, OpenType only has metrics for some writing systems. If we want the web to be a truly worldwide, we need metrics for the writing systems that have been left behind. Hebrew and Thai, for example, are designed sometimes with their top edge matching the cap height, sometimes matching the X height, and frequently somewhere in between. There's no corresponding OpenType metric. The CSS Working Group is doing its best to compensate for bad metrics. We're adding syntax for authors to provide their own metrics using the @fontface rules, so that they can override bad or missing metrics for any given font. Or if it's one of the metrics too untrustworthy to be used by default, to ask the browser to actually opt into using the ones in the font. We also want to ask the font community for help. If we want to create a better world for web typography, we need your cooperation. If you're a font designer or foundry, please ensure your fonts have accurate metrics. If you're a font tool vendor, help your users input accurate metrics into their font tables. If you're working on font APIs or libraries, please make those metrics available to layout applications. Sometimes the reason we can't use a metric is simply because the layout engineers can't get at them without parsing the font file themselves. And lastly, if you work on font formats, please expand the list of metrics to the rest of the writing systems in the world. Thank you.
Well, that was amazing. I hope everybody else is clapping too. Well, it was wonderful, and it was fantastic to see all of the conversations going on. I don't think we are going to have any shortage of questions and discussion, which is going to be awesome. And I think that it would be great if we could actually start off. I mean, first of all, thank you. The depth of consideration that for everybody here watching, if you have never read a CSS spec, go do that. Go look at some of the specs for text layout, and you will realize how much thought and consideration is put into this by the wonderful people who are in these working groups. So like seeing all of those different details that you brought up are absolutely amazing, and thank you for everything that you do. Ollie Meyer had a question about what happens with accents when you're using something like leading trim. So I wonder if maybe you could kind of talk about those things that fall outside of that box.
Yeah, so leading trim wouldn't trim the glyphs. It only trims what we're measuring. So from the layout perspective, we wouldn't see those accents. We would just position the text as if it doesn't have any. But when you're painting them, you will draw everything.
Got it.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not clipping. It's just using it to measure from the top and bottom.
It's definitely not clipping.
Awesome. That's great. So that's good. There was there was kind of some amazing discussions going on, and you really kind of hinted at this sort of at the end about that's great, but what happens when the metrics aren't there or they're not very consistent? And you did kind of address that, but I'm wondering if you can shed some light on what did you find as you were exploring font files? I mean, were there some that are good and some that are bad, or is it like mostly inconsistent or too all over the place?
So I personally didn't do this part, but I definitely know that John Daggett, who was implementing for Firefox, was originally intended to use the OpenType metrics for superscripts and subscripts and other things, and was like, yeah, this is way too much of a mess. It looks better overall if I just use my own numbers. And that's kind of sad, because the designer is the one who has all of the information to actually get it to look perfect. But when that information isn't there, it's misleading. That causes problems. So yeah, so a lot of these cases, some of these things that we want to do, by default, we won't be able to do them correctly. And you'll have to opt in or override the metrics or something. But we're hoping that high quality fonts and the more professional groups hopefully will start to care about these metrics now that they're actually being used for something, and that it might take a while, but hopefully we'll see an improvement in the quality of metrics data in OpenType fonts.
So there was an interesting follow-up to that from Lawrence Penny, asking about, have you looked at system fonts and are they constructed any better?
I haven't, so I can't answer that question.
that's okay. I mean, I think there are probably some people here who might have worked on some of them. I mean, so we have another moderator here who has worked a little bit on a font that might be a sort of more OS level one. Or at least for Office. Aaron, what has your experience been? Do you work with that part of the font internals?
Oh gosh, I shouldn't be answering the question. No, away from me. Learning how to do font metrics correctly is very complicated and difficult, and I'm sure I'm not doing it correctly either. So I don't know. If people in the chat want to post resources and things that we can send to people, please do that too. Yeah, I don't know. I probably can't speak to that. But when you do encounter a font that does have metrics problems that won't work with the the baselines that you're talking about, what do you do? Do you put it on a do not use list, or how do you flag this?
I think there are some. I definitely remember some of our implementers being yeah, so we have a list of these fonts which we just never look at this metric for. But that doesn't scale very well, so it would be nice not to add more things to that list. But there are a lot of common fonts from the 90s or whatever. open early 2000s that are on the like, this is bad, don't look at its metrics table list. Yeah, I think it would help if font tools were able to like auto calculate a lot of these. Just even if you don't get it perfectly, like the one the really like people who really care can fine tune it, but frequently like you can get an approximation by okay, let's take the top of the T and drop a line down the center and see where it hits, and where it hits the glyph outline will say that that's the cap height. That's better than putting a random number in there.
That's actually, I think, a number of the comments that have been kind of flying by. Simon Cousins brought up the situation where there's a particular font tool that will simply make up a number if the designer hasn't supplied one and not really let them know that that has happened. So I think the notion, like, it is the font tools that certainly have to be part of that solution.
Yeah.
Yeah. John Hudson just said that based on my experience, system font vertical metrics tend to be carefully set, but super and subscript synthesis values less so. Yeah, I think that definitely makes sense too. Do you I have a question while I was watching this presentation. I also was wondering, do you also figure into like underline? Is that something you're thinking about too? Those.
So yeah, actually there's a, in CSS text level 4, we have the ability to set the underline position like explicitly. You can reference either the alphabetic baseline or I think the top or bottom of the font. And we have a from font keyword that lets you opt into using whatever metrics are in the font for the underline position, thickness, etc. So yeah, that's another set of metrics that I guess I forgot to mention. We do want to use in CSS.
I think one of the recurring threads that I first became aware of when variable fonts started to become a thing was whether or not other kinds of internals were well or poorly cared for, and I kind of feel like those things just haven't been that visible until now. So, I think, as somebody put it, I think Ollie put it in the like the messes on both sides. Like there has to be work in the tools, there has to be work in the fonts, and everybody had to have a reason to care. And I think this is like one of those things. Like this gives us a reason to care.
Yeah, that's the general problem we have with metadata, like in every field. If there's no tool that exposes it, then even if everyone has the best intentions, it gets out of sync. But yeah, here it's a real mess for fonts, and it's kind of holding us back.
Well, there's another question that popped up. How well does this work with Latin fonts that are wildly irregular in shape and position, such as handwriting and calligraphic sort of faces?
So even for handwriting and calligraphic typefaces, like, you're always having a reference line. And so, yeah, maybe the T is slightly shorter on this font than the like D or whatever, but there's a reference line that you're using when you're designing each of the glyphs. And so that reference line is the line that needs to be encoded in your metrics. So for calligraphic and handwriting fonts, you will really need the font designer to like make adjustments manually to that metric. It's not going to be whatever gets auto-calculated is likely to be off. But you're not just like designing fonts in like space completely randomly. So you just got to figure out, well, where is that line that I'm designing around, and put that in the metrics.
I can barely keep up with the comments. This is insane. There's so many people writing. Oh, Jason, did you find one? Sorry.
No, I guess what I wanted to follow up on your observations about OpenType and like non-Western scripts. I'm trying to avoid. I don't want to. Trying to avoid those like terms that we're all trying to not use. I want to be
actually
more even-handed
more
about
than
it.
just non-Western, because CJK is very well supported, because there was a lot of effort by I think the Japanese community primarily, to make sure that their typesetting requirements were well supported. in tech generally. But we don't have that same kind of engagement from like Southeast Asia or the Middle East. I think they definitely got deep into like BiDi and stuff, but we didn't hear too much about them on metrics. And I think it's also harder for Arabic. It doesn't have, it has a lot more like reference lines than most writing systems does.
I was just really struck by like when you had that illustration of all of these different alignment lines throughout all these different kinds of text, that was so much more than I knew anything about. So with that being the case, I mean, how far away do you think some of these things are from potentially being usable? I mean, I know that's kind of hard to predict.
So the font variant position stuff is implemented in Firefox, and I think you just got to get like Chrome and Safari to care. The kind of new line box model is like super exploratory stages, just throwing out ideas kind of on stage where we're trying to figure out like, okay, what are different ways that we could have a new line model and what's going to actually help solve the problems the best. Letting trim, I think we have a fairly solid idea. We want to have these metrics and we want to be able to trim them from the beginning, first line of the block and the last line of the block. But there's some complications against, okay, well, when you have let's say you have an article element and I want to do rolling trim on that. It has to actually like introspect deeper if I have some divs or if I have a H1 or whatever, it has to hit the top of the H1 and the last thing on the thing. So the last paired line of the last paragraph, you don't want to trim in between every paragraph within the article. So defining exactly how that works, what cases do we actually introspect? What cases do we not introspect? Like if you put a border around there, maybe you don't want to actually introspect into the border. That's going to be weird. The box putting the border needs to kind of make that. So figuring out, okay, which boxes do we pass through? Which boxes do we not pass through is a question we have to answer. And another question is, okay, well, we have a line of text and there's multiple fonts on the line, multiple font sizes on the line. Like which one are we trimming down to? Are we trimming down to the tallest one, or are we trimming down to the main one, or are we doing something else entirely? So those are questions that are open and we have to like discuss and come to a conclusion on. But once we figure out how it's supposed to behave in the context of like an HTML document, then I think there's definitely interest in getting it implemented. So I think it's probably going to take another couple of years, is my guess, before we start seeing it, and then you'll probably see it in one browser before the others. That's probably going to be Chrome.
Well, I would imagine that it's also potentially something seen in JavaScript. Lawrence Penny was asking whether or not these metrics are exposed in JavaScript at this point. I don't know if that's knowable.
I don't know. I haven't followed too much on the JavaScript APIs, but I can say that there's a number of metrics that even the layout engine developers don't have access to because the operating system font API didn't allow them to get at that info. And so that's another problem, is that we need the actual, whoever's creating the API to use the font needs to make all of these metrics available to the layout application developers, like the browser or InDesign or any of the others, because people don't want to parse the font file themselves. Right.
Yeah, that's I was thinking of that because, you know, I think what we often see on the web is JavaScript gets used to sort of polyfill things, which then sort of eventually become standards. And I'm sure that's where Lawrence was headed. That's what I love about Nathan Ford's Widow Adjust. I mean, it's something that is just doing this like reverse recursion back up the page to sort of balance out the paragraphs, but it actually is relatively performant, at least for my own uses. So it's kind of interesting to see when those things are possible. Ollie Meyer was asking again about how people participate. So maybe it would be good to hear from you about where the discussion is happening and how people can participate in it.
Sure. So the discussion is happening for most of these things in the CSS working group. We have a GitHub repository. Let me grab the URL. This is our GitHub repository. And then we have our the draft where most of this is happening is inline layout. Here we go.
So for people who might have the Q&A tab open at the moment, check in the room chat, and there's a couple of great links in there.
Yeah, that's the spec. And so, yeah, read the spec, give us comments. I will say that, like, if you file a comment and you don't get a response for several months, that's normal. Because we have a lot of issues and we kind of cycle through which spec we're working on at any given week. So what'll happen is there'll be many weeks where there's nothing happening on a spec, and then suddenly the next 3 weeks, like, get tons of discussion about that one spec. Because we have about 100 different modules in CSS. So, and the number of editors is small. I edit probably about 1/3 of them. So
Wow.
I can't do them all at once.
Why ever not? What do you mean?
Because I have to prepare talks for 8 times.
It all comes back to being our fault. So Ollie had another question, if I can
Sure.
divert away from the blame being thrown back in our lap. He was asking if do we still face any issues with different UPM in fonts?
I would imagine that all of your metrics are in the same coordinate system as your glyph outlines, and everything is consistent within a single font, right?
I actually don't know. I don't make them.
Yeah.
So then we're not. Whatever units you decide to use is the units you decide to use, and we're referencing your coordinate system, so I don't think it would affect like the layout application.
I wonder, like, maybe they were referring to if you're using 2 different fonts in the same, like, paragraph or something.
Yeah, but we tell them, like, okay, we tell the font, we're going to size this font at like 16 pixels or whatever, and we're going to size the other font at 16 pixels. Now you'll notice that the font designer might have designed their font to look different or taller or smaller at 16 pixels. But that's because the font designer decided to do that. Now, we actually just added a feature, drafted up a feature to help normalize fonts that have different kind of design feeling. There's a variety of ways to have a different kind of size feeling. I don't know, like it's like the physical size might be the same, but it will feel larger or smaller depending on the design of the font. So one way, a very obvious way, is like X heights versus ascent. Like you can match the tab heights of 2 fonts and have them be perfectly lined up at 16 pixels. But if this has like a short and this one has a taller X height and this one has a shorter one, then this one will feel bigger. It will be easier to read at a smaller size. So in CSS, there actually is a feature for normalizing across using the X height, but that only works for writing systems that have an X height. And it also doesn't solve other aspects of why something might look larger or smaller. So we added the ability for @FontFace to take a size adjust descriptor, which is a percentage. And so that you would say like, oh, okay, this font feels bigger than the other font. So I'm going to tell it to be like 90%. So when I ask for a 16 pixel font, it'll scale it down a little bit. And when you have your font fallback stack, or you're changing the font in the line because like you're emphasizing something or whatever, we will apply that scale factor across the entire, like whenever we use the font, but not when we're calculating the M unit because the M unit is the nominal font size. So that will make it possible to like manually tweak things and normalize them so they look the same.
Right. So there was some interesting chat following along with that. And according to Sai, he has not seen any drastically different unit scales, 1000 UPM versus 2048 in recent memory. And Peter Constable is also pointing out what you were mentioning about 1M really kind of normalizing things considerably, and then the specifics of the internals of the measurement not really mattering all that much.
Yeah, we're almost out of time. So is there any like last question you can ask maybe? You could ask Ethan, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. And then, thank you, Fantasai, for answering all the questions. And yeah, thank you guys for having us.
Is there more do you guys want to talk more in the Hangout room after this is over about this? There's like so many questions. Hope so. Let's see. Different scripts really want different line spacing. Any thoughts?
Yeah,
What does that mean?
so for example, if you're writing a English text versus like I think Chinese text, you need a little bit more of a gap for the Chinese text because in the English text we have a lot of gap because of the ascenders and descenders, but Chinese text is really dense. So to create like similar feeling of openness, you need more space. The way to do that is to set a different line height value depending on your content. There is a Lang selector and you can select using the Lang selector. One of the tricky things about the Lang selector is that it selects based on language and not on writing system. So if you are working with like a very large collection of content in many languages, it would be nice to be able to say, I want things that are in this particular writing system. We don't have a way to say that yet.
You mean we don't have the metadata for that?
So the CSS.
No, I was just making a terrible pun. I'm sorry. That's
the metadata. I think actually does exist. Unicode has a database in the CLDR, I think, or something. Somewhere there's a database that says this writing system is typically written in this language is typically written in this writing system. And so if you know the language, you can know the writing system in most cases. But that's like a mapping that needs to be built in, and we have to, build in the feature into the browser to be able to do that lookup.
Awesome. Well, this has been fantastic.
I thought they were going to kick us off.
Yeah, I know. I was like, I wanted to like get a thank you in there before it like cut everything off, but I guess it didn't automatically explode. So that's good.
Yeah, huge thank you to both of you for presenting, and everyone loved it through so much. So yeah, everyone, do you want to head back over to the Hangout room and we can have more discussion?
Well, you're certainly welcome to. It would be wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys for having us.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you so much.
I'm glad you liked this. Awesome.